Good morning. Thank you for coming to our Nordic semester presentation this morning. The Nordic semester features the countries of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. And we have concentrated more on Norway and Sweden this semester, so I think it's time that we show Denmark a little love today with this presentation by on Hans Christian Andersen, a Danish national treasure. Our speaker needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Dr. Michael Howarth, an associate professor of English and director of the honors program at Missouri Southern. He is a widely regarded expert on children's literature as well as on film studies. He has a PhD in children's literature from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Howie, as he is affectionately known, is an accomplished writer. His books include Under the Bed, Creeping, Psychoanalyzing the Gothic in Children's Literature, and Fairweather Ninjas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Howarth.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for being here today to talk about Hans Christian Andersen. How many of you are familiar with Hans Christian Andersen? I'm sure, hopefully some of you have at least heard his name. Some of you may have actually read some of his works. Some of you may have stumbled in here out of curiosity, not quite sure what you've just gotten yourselves into. But either way, we're going to talk about his life and also how his life affected his writings. Hans Christian Andersen was born in 1805, died in 1875, had a very rich life. And throughout the presentation, I'm going to read some excerpts from some of his fairy tales. This is his completed collection. You could use it as a doorstop if you wanted to. And I'm also going to share some quotations that I think will add a little bit more flavor to his life on top of that. Here's a man who was quite prolific in his writing. He lived to be 70, and in those 70 years, he published 6 novels, a few collections of poetry, he wrote several plays, he wrote travelogues, he wrote 3 autobiographies, he wrote an almanac spanning 40 years, and he wrote diaries spanning 50 years. So he was very busy throughout most of his life. Nowadays, of course, Hans Christian Andersen is mostly known for his children's writing. And that's probably, if you're familiar with him, where you know him from as well, is his fairy tales. He was one of the innovators of what we call the literary fairy tale, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later on. And some of his fairy tales that you may be familiar with include The Ugly Duckling, Thumbelina, The Princess and the Pea, The Little Mermaid, which Disney made into a classic film. And of course, one of his most famous is The Snow Queen, which a few years ago Disney made into the film Frozen. Okay, so you're familiar with him in several ways, even if you don't know that it's Hans Christian Andersen. But I want to spend some time talking about his life today and just giving you some highlights, because I think who he was as a person certainly influenced his writing. Sometimes in literature, we refer to this as genetic criticism, which means we look at the work primarily through the author's life and times and how the author's own personal conflicts and trials and tribulations affected what the author wrote. And in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, we can see a lot of his own personal life reflected through certain characters and certain settings and certain scenes as well. Here's a picture of the man. He was not considered very attractive. And that is not my assessment. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying that Hans Christian Andersen is ugly. But throughout his life, he was often referred to as unattractive, not particularly pleasing to the eye, so to speak. But I want to start off with a quotation, a passage from one of his autobiographies, written when he was 50 years old. Okay? My life is a beautiful fairy tale, so rich and so blessed. If when I was a boy and went out into the world poor and lonely, I had met a powerful fairy godmother, and she had said, "Choose your way and goal in life, and I will protect and lead you according to the development of your mind and spirit, and in the way that these things happen in a sensible world. My destiny could not have been conducted more happily, wisely, and better than it has been." He wrote this when he was 50. Now, based on this passage, you would think that his life was full of joy and full of wonder, and that nothing bad ever happened. This is the life he wanted to present to the outside world, to his public, to the audience, to the people who had grown to love his fairy tales. But the question remains, how accurate of a representation of his life is this? It's not. So let's talk about that for a second. Hans Christian Andersen was born in Denmark. And his parents got married 2 months before he was born. His father was a poor shoemaker who died when Andersen was 11 years old. His mother was a washerwoman for rich families. She was 10 years older than his father. She already had a 6-year-old child born out of wedlock by the time Andersen was born. His grandmother had 3 children with 3 different men, which at one point earned her an 8-day prison sentence. Yeah, right? Okay, kind of harsh back then. His aunt ran a brothel in Copenhagen. His paternal grandfather went insane and would often run through the streets yelling and screaming while children ran after him, throwing rocks and vegetables at him. Needless to say, Hans Christian Andersen was a little embarrassed and often hid in shame. I'd like to think that the holidays at the Andersen house were very colorful and full of interesting discussions. Let's just say that. So, you know, this fairy tale idea that he presented, he certainly had some conflict and strife in his life when he was younger. His mother never learned to read or write. She was illiterate. His father, however, was a self-taught man who had learned to read and write. And it was from his father that Hans Christian Andersen got his love of literature. His father would often sit up with him at night, and he would relate to him oral stories, folklore, mythology, fairy tales that had been written prior to Andersen's birth. And so Andersen started to develop this love of literature and to think about characters and settings, and he would make up imaginary adventures for himself. And this was one of the ways that he was able to combat the living conditions that he found himself in, because he grew up poor, and he struggled with poverty and prejudice his entire life. And at the age of 7, his parents took him to the theater, and he fell in love with the stage and the costumes and the sets. And he decided then and there that he wanted to be an actor. He wanted to be involved in the theater somehow and contribute something and live in this world where anything was possible. You could be any character. You could be any person, right? You could always be the hero. He was not a hero in real life, as we'll see. So, and he said that at that moment, when he was 7 years old, he knew he wanted to be famous. And that was something that he strove for, right, his entire life. So this is the house he grew up in, and he was a very lonely child. He always appeared sickly. He was gaunt, he was tall, and he was thin. I like to think of him as a European version of Ichabod Crane, right? He didn't have many friends. As I said before, he struggled with poverty and prejudice his entire life. Right? His family was a little sordid, right? They weren't the most popular in town, so he always found himself playing by himself. And because of that, he became very creative. He created paper dolls, and he created puppets, and he created all these interesting stories and went on adventures, and he played by himself. He did not have a lot of friends. And he often said that his school days were the most bitter and lonely of my entire life, right? And at one point, when he went to many different schools, he lived with a headmaster who punished him regularly. And the reason was to improve your character. And Hans Christian Andersen also said that the schools he went to discouraged him from writing. and that depressed him even more, because writing was one of the outlets that he had, the way that he could express himself. His loneliness, his shyness, right? His family life. He had all this pain, he had all this anger, and how would he release it? Right? He often tried to do that through his writing. He didn't have a lot of support at home. His father died when he was 11. So Hans Christian Andersen was forced to support himself. He was a weaver's apprentice. He worked for a tailor. And at the age of 14, he left home. He set out on his own. He moved to Copenhagen, the biggest city at that time. And he decided, I'm going to be an actor. Problem was, he wasn't a very good actor. In fact, he was pretty terrible. And so when he got to Copenhagen, he was taken under the wing by a local patron of the arts who supported him. And then he was accepted to the Royal Danish Theatre. It's a nice building, right? It's something you can put on your resume. I got accepted at the Royal Danish Theatre. Very impressive. As I said before, though, he wasn't a good actor. He had a wonderful soprano voice, and that was the main reason that he got in. But he was told that his feet were too big. He was told that he couldn't act. And he was also told that he was too unattractive to be an actor. Aw, right? They're like, nobody is going to want to come see you up on the stage. You're going to scare everybody away, Hans Christian Andersen. But one of the people that he did work with said to him, you should be a poet. You have a way with words. When you speak, it's very eloquent. You use very nice descriptions. You have ornate, flowery language. You should be a poet. And so since his acting career wasn't going anywhere, and since he was told it's not going anywhere, he decided to start writing. And so that's what he did. And he published a couple of short stories. He published his first short story when he was 17. That's pretty impressive, right? And then a couple years later, he published a collection, again, of poems. And then he published a couple more short stories. And he soon began to earn a name for himself. And people started to talk about this guy, Hans Christian Andersen, who's publishing some poems and some stories. He got so famous that the king awarded him a travel grant, right, in 1833. A small travel grant so that he could travel around the countryside. And not only in his country, but also throughout Europe. This was the beginning of Hans Christian Andersen's international acclaim, was the king awarding him a travel grant where he could go study. Kind of like when Dr. Stebbins awards the grants for international studies, right? Hans Christian Andersen would have been a great spokesperson, right, for the study abroad program here. And his motto after this became, to travel is to live. That's what he said. To travel is to live, right? And think about this for a second. Think about a young man who feels very closed in his entire life, who doesn't have opportunities because he's poor, and because his family maybe has a bad name, and the fact that he can't go anywhere, and that he's been told he's unattractive. And think about the opportunities presented to him when he can now travel all throughout Europe. One of the things that this does is the more you travel, the more you can observe. And the more you can observe other people and other habits and other customs, the more material you have to work with when you write stories. And a lot of his stories were taken from places he traveled to and the people he observed. So this was an excellent opportunity for him to travel around. In 1837, one of the places he traveled to was Sweden. And he was just blown away by how beautiful the country was and how friendly the people were. And he started to think about Scandinavia. And he started to think about how proud he was to be a Scandinavian. And so he wrote a very famous poem called I Am a Scandinavian. I'd like to share an excerpt with you and then talk about that for a second. We are one people. We are called Scandinavians. In 3 realms our homeland is divided, but between the great heavenly gifts it lies. Our heart grows into one, let it be forgotten if wrong was done unto us. On mountains and woods and by the night blue sea, I shout with joy, I am a Scandinavian. Let not this joyous unity disappear. Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish stretch out for each other's hand. The old folk songs join us. In melody, a strong bond exists. Of unity's seeds, only good can be harvested. We scout eagerly towards west and east in joy and sorrow. Oh, it's good to live here. Here our loved ones live. From spruce to birch and beech, across seas, resound song of joy. I am a Scandinavian. It's a nice poem. It's a very long poem. And Andersen said at one point, he said, I wrote this poem, quote, to capture the beauty of the Nordic spirit, the way the three sister nations have gradually grown together. So why is this poem important? Well, again, Andersen is very excited because he feels like he belongs to Scandinavia. And this is a young man who didn't feel like he belonged anywhere during his childhood because he was always excluded, he was bullied, he was left out. So the fact that he feels a connection to his homeland was something that he wanted to broadcast widely, right? When you're lonely and you don't have any friends and you're very shy, belonging to anything is very important. And so he reached out for that. And he worked very hard his entire life. I want to make that very clear, right? Even when he was told he couldn't act, when he was poor, when kids didn't want to play with him, even when in love, which we'll talk about, right? He persevered as much as he could. He worked hard. And it did pay off, right? It's because he ended up traveling that he wrote this poem. It's because of the poetry collections he published as a result that he then became famous and was treated as a dignitary wherever he went. When he was 33 years old, a couple years after this poem came out, the king awarded him a lifetime stipend for writing. At 33 years old, he was set. I don't remember what I was doing at 33, but it certainly wasn't being awarded a stipend to write for the rest of my life, right? So he was set up. By that point, he was well known, and he became a dignitary, and he traveled all over Europe. He traveled to Spain, he traveled to Italy, right? And he traveled to England. And everywhere he went, large crowds greeted him. They wanted to meet Hans Christian Andersen, who was making a name for himself. And he would sign autographs, and he would talk to people. And at this point, he was starting to publish a lot more fairy tales for children. Okay? This is not Hans Christian Andersen. This is Charles Dickens, who some of you may know. I hope all of you have heard of Charles Dickens before. I want to talk about Charles Dickens for a second because Hans Christian Andersen met him and absolutely loved Dickens. On his first trip to England, he was at a party, and Charles Dickens was there. That's pretty awesome that you can say that. I was at a party and Charles Dickens showed up. And Andersen says in his autobiography, we had come to the veranda, and I was so happy to see and speak to England's now living writer, whom I love the most. He was enamored with Charles Dickens. And Dickens was an admirer of Hans Christian Andersen. And they spent the night talking about writing and about where they had traveled to. And it was a very nice conversation. And Andersen never forgot it. And when he went back home to Denmark, he ended up beginning a correspondence with Charles Dickens that lasted for 10 years. And they wrote letters back and forth. And they talked about books they had written. And they talked about reviews, good reviews, bad reviews. Right? 10 years after they first met, Andersen traveled back to England. And he said, I'm going to stay with you, Charles Dickens, if you don't mind. And Dickens said, no, I don't mind. You can come stay with me. Andersen said, I'm going to stay for about a week. He stayed for 5. Dickens was not happy. Dickens was not happy at all. This really killed their friendship. Dickens ceased writing letters to him after that. Dickens was not happy. He called him a bore, right? Apparently, Andersen complained about how cold the house was. While he was there, he got a bad review from one of his new books, and Dickens said that he was on the front lawn crying about it, right? And he told him to get up and deal with it. This is like when your mom says, rub some dirt in it. You know, get up, you can deal with it. So their correspondence did not go very well. He stayed for 5 weeks, and then he finally left. Dickens was very annoyed. And after Andersen left the house, Dickens wrote a note that he left in the room, the guest room, for anybody else who came to visit. And it said, hence, Hans Christian Andersen stayed in this room for 5 weeks, which to the family seemed ages. Yes. Now, why do I tell that story? For an example of how Hans Christian Andersen had some awkward social skills through his entire life. Because he was shy, because he was lonely, because he didn't have a lot of interactions with other people, his social skills were not the best, as we can see in this situation. When you go to visit somebody's house, and this is a good lesson, you don't stay for 5 weeks, right? I'm sure Dickens gave him some hints, and I'm sure Andersen didn't catch on to them. Benjamin Franklin said, fish and visitors start to smell after 3 days. And Andersen stayed 5 weeks. So Andersen could never understand why his friendship with Dickens deteriorated. He wrote that. He said he stopped writing letters to me. And I don't understand. I thought we had a wonderful time. It's like, did you? Because apparently what Dickens wrote was not that he had a very wonderful time. So he was awkward in his friendships. He had trouble making friends. He had trouble keeping friends as well. He didn't always react to social situations in the proper way. He was also unlucky in love. He often fell in love with beautiful women who we would say now were far above what he was probably capable of. Oh, it is sad. And he wanted that. We don't know a lot about his love life. We know what he wrote in his autobiography, but again, sometimes things are colored in your autobiography, like that passage I read to you about how my life was so amazingly wonderful. But we do have an excerpt he wrote. He wrote in his diary, Almighty God, thee only have I. Thou steerest my fate. I must give myself up to thee. Give me a livelihood. Give me a bride. My blood wants love as my heart does. He was lonely, right? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he was celibate his entire life, right? And this was one of his lovers in his mind, not in real life. And as I said, this quote is very telling. Her name was Reborg Voigt. The love was unrequited. He professed his love for her. She refused him. Years later, we're talking decades later, when he died, a pouch was found on him containing one of her letters to him that he had kept. I know, right? It's very sad. There was another girl, an opera singer, that he fell madly in love with. She was beautiful. She considered him a brother and told him that. He proposed to her. She turned him down. He proposed to her via letter. He was awkward. He gave her a letter as she was getting on a train. He said, will you marry me? She said no. This would be like texting someone a proposal today. You don't do that. You got to do it face to face. So clearly, he was a little bit awkward in his relationships. And that affected him his entire life. And as we'll see when we talk about some of his fairy tales, it's very clear that he was working out some of these conflicts and issues. Here's another picture of the great man later in his life. Despite the fact that he wrote wonderful fairy tales, many of which were full of hope, right, and had happy endings, there was a darkness about Hans Christian Andersen. Clearly, just thinking about his life that we've talked about so far, you can see he had many conflicts and many troubles, right, that he never really got over. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of how quirky and paranoid and dark he could be. He always traveled with a rope. In case there was a fire at a hotel, he could climb out the window. if he stayed on a high floor, he always carried a rope with him. Just in case there was a fire, he wanted to be able to get out. Throw it out the window, climb down. You guys don't need to do that, right? But that's what he did. He was absolutely terrified of being buried alive. I don't know how that situation comes up, right? And I feel like that's something we all probably should be scared about. But he was absolutely terrified of being buried alive. So much so that in his later years, when he was getting older, and maybe not in the best health, he would often leave a note on his bedside that read, "I only look dead." Just in case he fell asleep and somebody found him, they didn't think he was dead and try to bury him or do something like that, right? So he was very paranoid about this. So clearly he had some strange habits. He had some strange habits. But I will say this. One of the things that makes him such a great writer is because he was able to observe people to such a large extent. So that's a little bit about his life. And clearly, it's not quite as puppy dogs and roses as we'd like to think it is. So I want to talk about his fairy tales. And I don't think we can really talk about his fairy tales until we get a sense of what fairy tales were like before Hans Christian Andersen began writing. Up to this point, most of the fairy tales that had been published were based on oral traditions. So the Grimm brothers, they published their famous Nursery and Household Tales edition in 1812. It was a huge hit. Charles Perrault in France, who wrote versions of Puss in Boots and Cinderella, published his version in 1697. So fairy tales had been around for a long time. But they were based on oral traditions. They were based on tales that had been passed down from generation to generation to generation, especially when there wasn't a printing press, before they started mass-producing books, right? They wanted to preserve these stories, so they had to tell them orally. And if you tell a story orally because you want to preserve it, you don't usually include a lot of detail in description. The more you say, the more you have to remember, right? So they cut them down. So if you look at some of the original fairy tales by Charles Perrault and the Grimm brothers, they're fairly simple in terms of the use of language. There's not a lot of description. It's mostly action, right? This happens, this happens, this happens. This is very different from, say, somebody like Tolkien, who, as I like to say, would spend 2 pages describing a leaf, right? And I'm not saying Tolkien's a bad writer, but the description there, right, he spends a lot of time on description. And the original fairy tales did not do that. Hans Christian Andersen would have grown up listening to a lot of these fairy tales. What makes Hans Christian Andersen so interesting is that he was one of the pioneers of what we call the literary folktale. Okay? So he actually took fairy tales and he wrote his own. He didn't borrow from a lot of others. He may have borrowed bits and pieces, but he wrote his own fairy tales. And if we talk about pioneers of children's literature in terms of the literary fairy tale, there's Hans Christian Andersen and there's Oscar Wilde, whose book, The Happy Prince and Other Tales, is a landmark in terms of literary fairy tales. And if you haven't read that, that's a great book to read. Okay, Oscar Wilde is fantastic. It's fantastic. So Hans Christian Andersen was trying some new things with his fairy tales. For one thing, he includes a lot of description. He includes flowery language. The Grimm brothers might have started a story off by saying, once upon a time there was a woodcutter who lived in a forest. Once upon a time there was a gardener who lived in town and had 3 sons. That's how it starts off. There's not a lot of description there, is it? It's very simple, it's very easy. It immediately sets us into the scene, right? Hans Christian Andersen also used sounds in his work, which hadn't really been done before. And what he did was he actually wrote as if he was talking to a child, which was something that hadn't happened before. And he got some crap for this. A lot of people thought he shouldn't be doing this. They thought that the fairy tales should be written for children as if they were adults. He said, but they're children. They're still learning. And so there was a little bit of a conflict over that, especially because he was writing during a time when childhood was idealized and romanticized. And he would say, well, children aren't always sunny and happy, are they? Some of you may have kids. They throw temper tantrums, and they can get jealous, and they can get angry, and they can get depressed, and they experience every emotion that we experience because they're human beings. And so Andersen didn't really want to separate children and create only an idealized version of childhood. And so his tales reflect that. So there's a lot of description going on in his stories. And I want to read to you just the very opening paragraph from The Ugly Duckling, which I think is a great example to show this. It was lovely summer weather in the country, and the golden corn, the green oats, and the haystacks piled up in the meadows looked beautiful. The stork walking about on his long red legs chattered in the Egyptian language, which he had learned from his mother. The cornfields and meadows were surrounded by large forests, in the midst of which were deep pools. It was indeed delightful to walk about in the country. In a sunny spot stood a pleasant old farmhouse close by a deep river. And from the house down to the waterside grew great burdock leaves, so high that under the tallest of them a little child could stand upright. The spot was as wild as the center of a thick wood. In this snug retreat sat a duck on her nest, watching for her young brood to hatch. She was beginning to get tired of her task, for the little ones were a long time coming out of their shells, and she seldom had any visitors. The other ducks liked much better to swim about in the river than to climb the slippery banks and sit under a burdock leaf to have a gossip with her. At length, one shell cracked, and then another, and from each egg came a living creature that lifted its head and cried, "Peep, peep." "Quack, quack," said the mother, and then they all quacked as well as they could and looked about them on every side at the large green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look as much as they liked, because green is good for the eyes. "How large the world is," said the young ducks when they found how much more room they now had than while they were inside the eggshell. "Do you imagine this is the whole world?" asked the mother. "Wait till you have seen the garden. It stretches far beyond that to the parson's field, but I have never ventured to such a distance. Are you all out?" she continued, rising. "No, I declare, the largest egg lies there still. I wonder how long this is to last. I am quite tired of it." And she seated herself again on the nest. Well, one thing you can tell is that's a very long paragraph, right? The original fairy tales have very short paragraphs. When you have short paragraphs, your eyes move down the page faster, so it creates a very quick pace, right? Andersen wanted to create a scene. You can tell how much description is just in that paragraph. He's describing the forest, he's describing the water, right? So he's allowing a child to visually picture all these elements, and it's a very long paragraph, right? It's kind of a nice, relaxed setting. So he's using sounds again. So his style was very different. How many of you have read The Ugly Duckling before? Anybody? Okay, right? It's a great story. So let's talk about some of his fairy tales. Let's talk about The Ugly Duckling. The Ugly Duckling is about a duck who's ugly. You know, when Dr. Stebbins asked me to talk about Hans Christian Andersen, he said, "What are you planning to do?" And I said, I think I'll just show a 45-minute documentary on Hans Christian Andersen. And he said, "That's probably not a good idea." And I said, "Well, maybe I'll show the first 45 minutes of Frozen." And he said, "No, that's probably not a good idea." I said, "Well, maybe I'll just read for 45 minutes straight." He said, "That's probably not a good idea." So we bounce back and forth here. But the last duckling that hatches is considered ugly. Why? Because it doesn't look like everybody else. And the duckling's mother says, "You're ugly." Nice mom, right? And the brothers and sisters say, "Hey, you're ugly." And the farm animals nip at it, right? And nobody wants to play with the ugly duckling. And he ends up leaving. He ends up leaving home and escaping. He runs away, right? Because some of them say to him, "It'd be better if you were never born." And so he runs away. And so he stays at a couple of different houses, and he meets a cat, and he meets other farm animals, and they talk to him, and they say, "Look, if you want to be like us, you have to act like us. You're ugly. Nobody's going to want to hang out with you," right? And so then he gets so depressed, right? And he thinks, "I just don't want to live anymore," right? But it turns out at the end of the story that one of the reasons he looks so different is because he's actually a swan. And at the end of the story, he turns into this beautiful swan. He's the most beautiful swan there is. And all the other swans swim up to him and they bow, right? And he becomes part of a community, a very important community. Does this sound familiar at all? Does this sound like Hans Christian Andersen might have connected with the Ugly Duckling? An outcast. Somebody who was told, you're no good, you're not attractive, you'll never amount to anything. Somebody who left home and traveled around trying to find his place in the world, trying to fit in. Right? The Ugly Duckling is Hans Christian Andersen. Right? And the success of the swan at the end of the story symbolizes Hans Christian Andersen's success as well. He was clearly making a statement here about his life and about the need to fit in. And also making a statement about how, you don't have to just alter your behavior and change to be somebody else so you can fit in. Because eventually, if you wait long enough, you'll find that group that you're meant to be with. And that was one of the lessons that he wanted to put forth. This is a lesson that is still applicable today. Kids are bullied today. Kids are told that they're not important or that they don't matter, that they can't do something, right? This is a story about self-confidence. It's a story about finding your own identity. We look at something like The Little Mermaid. Who's read The Little Mermaid, the story? It's very sad, actually, right? Some of you, I'm sure most of you have seen the Disney movie, right? But The Little Mermaid is, it's fairly similar. She sees, she lives under the sea. She meets, the prince. There's a shipwreck. She falls in love with him. She says, I want to be with him. And so she ends up going to the shore and trying to romance him. All right, Hans Christian Andersen, what's going on here in your life? The courtship between the Little Mermaid and the prince is awkward, like Andersen's life, right? Didn't really work out all that well. And also, Andersen had a big issue with the sacrifices that certain people had to make and other people didn't. In The Little Mermaid, the mermaids live 300 years. But when they die, they die. That's it. Whereas he describes in the fairy tale how humans live much shorter lives. But he says they are guaranteed of immortality. And the Little Mermaid, certainly she wants the prince. She likes him. She's attracted to him. But she also craves that immortality, right? Clearly that's something that a lot of people would find fascinating, right? But look at what she has to sacrifice to get it. She sacrifices her voice. She sacrifices her family. She sacrifices her home. She has to go up to the shore and walk on legs. And it's not like the Disney movie where she gets some legs and it's a little clumsy and she falls down and there's a song. In the story, he talks about how every time she takes a step, it's like sharp knives digging into her. It hurts. There's pain. This sacrifice involves pain. And Hans Christian Andersen made it very clear that there's also a class struggle in this story. Think of the Little Mermaid as being poor Hans Christian Andersen. And think of the people on the top level, right, the humans, being the upper class. And we see that actually in the story. Under the sea, the lower class, above, the higher class, right? And he says, look at what the Little Mermaid has to give up. She has to sacrifice all this stuff for immortality. And then the people up above, what do they have to sacrifice for immortality? Nothing. It's just something they have, right? And throughout his life, he saw opportunities that rich people had that he didn't have. And that bothered him. Especially when he saw people who weren't very nice or who were mean or who maybe didn't deserve those opportunities, right? And so he struggled with that a lot in his life. Right? This idea that some people have opportunities that other people don't have. Some people deserve opportunities, but they're not awarded them. Right? So he's working out a lot of different issues in this story. He's talking about class issues. He's also talking about romance and love. There's some interesting Christian mythology in a lot of his stories, much like there were in Oscar Wilde's stories as well. Right? The Snow Queen is a... Who's read The Snow Queen? The Snow Queen is very different from Frozen, right? Very different. First of all, it's written in 6 or 7 different parts, little vignettes. But it's about 2 kids who are friends, and there's a magic mirror, right? And this mirror is created by a hobgoblin. It's just a cool word to say, hobgoblin, right? It's created by a hobgoblin. And this mirror, if you look into it, it makes everything around you look bad. So if you look into the mirror and there's beautiful things, they shrink down to almost nothing so you can't see them. And if there are bad things, they're magnified. And at the beginning of the story, the mirror shatters. And shards of it get stuck in people's eyes, in people's hearts. And their hearts grow cold as ice. And if a piece of the mirror, even a splinter, gets caught in their eyes, they start to see the world through a negative lens. They become more pessimistic. And it's about one of these kids who goes off with the Snow Queen, and the other little girl goes after her friend to try to save him, right, to bring him back. And she finally finds him at the very end of the story, and they reunite, and they come back home. And when they come back home, they look into a mirror and realize that they're all grown up. And if you're reading the story, you're thinking, what happened? How long did this journey actually take? Because it doesn't seem like it took that long. But suddenly they were kids to begin the story, and then they were adults at the end of the story. And it's really interesting because one of the things that fascinated Hans Christian Andersen about that story was its idea of how we perceive things by the way we look at them, right? The difference between life being subjective and objective. And of course, Disney took some of these ideas for their film, but they changed it around a lot. Hans Christian Andersen's story did not have a funny snowman in it, right? And so the Snow Queen was one of his most popular stories, right? And that's one of the stories that he's known for, along with the Ugly Duckling and certainly the Little Mermaid. But this story, in terms of the idea of beauty, certainly he's discussing that. But again, we see characters who are underdogs. We see characters who people think you can't survive, right? You can't complete this mission, so to speak, right? And if you think about it, that's what a lot of fairy tales are. Most of the heroes in fairy tales are the character who seems to be the weakest or the least intelligent. If there are 3 brothers in a fairy tale, it will almost always focus on the youngest or the weakest, right? The character that children can most relate to, right? And then that character triumphs in the end over characters who clearly symbolize adults. If you read a fairy tale and you look at dragons, ogres, giants, right? The big, huge, powerful characters, they often symbolize the adult figures. And if you think about it, how much control and power do kids actually have? Not much, right? What do you tell? You tell them what to eat. You tell them what to wear. You drive them places, right? Most kids aren't saying, hey, I'm going to do this weekend, okay? Can you just drive me there? Right? Everything is planned out for them. Where do they get to exert some control and test things out? In their imagination. That's why fairy tales are very important. And Hans Christian Andersen understood that. And his traveling became very important to his writing because he understood the idea of leaving home to grow as a person and then coming back home and being able to see that home with different eyes. And so in children's literature a lot, we talk about this idea of home away home, right? It's a big theme. This idea that in order to grow, in order to mature, right, you have to leave home at some point. Not with your parents, by yourself. You have to go off on your own. You have to deal with some sort of a conflict or a problem or an issue. You have to resolve it on your own. You have to grow as an individual. Then, once that happens, you can return home again a changed person. And we see this pattern over and over and over again. Not just really in children's literature, but in a lot of literature as well. Think about The Wizard of Oz. Home, away, home. How she changes. Think about how many fairy tales you read where it starts off outside of the woods. The character goes into the woods, has a conflict, has to deal with a threat, resolves that threat, and then is able to come back out of the forest again at the end. Right? How do you get that? By traveling, by expanding your boundaries, right? Going across borders, right? And most children's literature revolves around issues of separation. This idea that if you hold your parents' hands your entire life, you're not going to grow and mature. At some point, you need to let go. And that's hard for kids and for parents, right? It is, right? Neil Gaiman once gave a great quote. He said, the thing that really sucks about being a parent is that if you do your job right, your kids don't need you anymore. That's not to say they won't ever call you. But what he's trying to say is that if your kids grow and mature and they can be on their own, they can make decisions on their own without having to call you. At some point, they may buy a car, they may buy a house. You're going to make all these big adult decisions, and they won't need you to always be there for them because you won't always be able to be there for them. These are issues that Andersen was dealing with a lot in his life, and he tried to work them out through a lot of his stories. Okay? Now, how many of you have seen Frozen? Okay, I expect most of you have. They did actually pay a very nice homage, right, to Hans Christian Andersen. Through the use of 4 characters, right? They have a character named Hans, a character named Christoph, a character named Anna, and a character named Sven. And if you say their names very quickly together, Hans, Christoph, Anna, Sven, right? And so that was how they paid homage to the author through the film. So just a little bit of tidbit. Disney does this in a lot of their movies, but I thought you guys would find this just a little bit fascinating. So now next time you go to a party or something, you can throw this little bit out there, and people will think that you're really cool. Okay. So what's his legacy? Well, April 2nd, his birthday, is always International Children's Book Day. When he died, they were building a huge statue for him in Copenhagen, which still stands today. This is a statue of the Little Mermaid that sits in Copenhagen Harbor. In the United States, there are Hans Christian Andersen statues in New York City's Central Park and in Lincoln Park in Chicago. There is a Hans Christian Andersen puppet theater in Poland. And one man actually said, because Hans Christian Andersen is a nice, hardworking person who was not afraid of poverty, we have decided to build a $13 million theme park based on his life and tales. That opened in Shanghai in 2006. A multi-million-dollar theme park only about Hans Christian Andersen. The food, the exhibits, the rides, everything revolves around some aspect of his life. So clearly, he is a very important writer. His work has been translated into over 150 languages. When he died, he was one of the most popular writers in the world. But the important thing to recognize is how his life helped to shape his writings. And I think if you know a little bit about his life, when you read his fairy tales, or even some of his travelogues or autobiographies, you can still see traces of who he was as a person seeping through the pages and influencing certain themes or certain ideas or certain characters. Thank you. I will entertain questions if anybody has any, although I realize it's maybe time for classes, but and if nobody has any, that's fine too.
Where did the Little Match Girl come?
Well, the Little Match Girl, who's read the Little Match Girl? Not many people have read the Little Match Girl. If you want to cry, read the Little Match Girl. It is one of the most devastating stories I've ever read. And I don't use devastating lightly usually, but it's really sad. Andersen, when he traveled around a lot, saw poverty. He saw homeless children in a lot of his travels and wrote about that frequently, about how that bothered him. And The Little Match Girl is about a young girl who doesn't have a lot of money, and she's trying to sell matches, and it's the middle of winter, and it's freezing. I'm not going to tell you what happens in the story, but Hans Christian Andersen was clearly making a comment about child labor, during that. And those were observations he made through his travels, especially when he was in England. He had mentioned that too. Yeah. Other questions?
What's your name?
Huh?
Your name, sir?
Michael Howarth.
Howie.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.